Storytime about how I beat up my stalker of 4 years. When I was 18, I booked a major campaign. I started modeling at the age of 10, and it was a really big deal for me. This happened in a country where women are not treated very well. When my campaign came out, there were billboards of me everywhere in the city. My face was plastered on the internet and on social media too. Now from this, my Instagram grew a lot. Overnight, I went from having 6,000 followers to 40,000 followers. So by the end of the week, I had almost 100,000 followers. Again, this was a huge deal for me, and I was really happy about it. But things started getting really weird when I started checking my DMs. I had about 40 DMs from one guy alone. The rest of the DMs were thirst traps, but this guy was different. He was becoming obsessive literally overnight. Every other message was about how beautiful I was and how he wanted to marry me. Instead of replying, I decided to ignore his messages. From this campaign, I started getting even more modeling jobs, and I also started getting paid to post stuff on Instagram. I was super happy. When I checked my DMs again, I noticed that he was messaging me even more. Once again, I ignored every single one of his messages. But after 4 days, he started getting really angry. Started commenting bitch on all of my pictures. Got to the point where I had to tell my modeling agency, and they just told me to ignore him too. A few days later, I opened his DMs only to see a picture of my house. Part 2 of how I beat up my stalker of 4 years. When I opened his DM, I saw that he sent me a picture of my own house. And this meant he knew where I lived. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me an Instagram. Once again, I told my modeling agency, and again, they told me to just ignore it. But it terrified me that he knew where I lived. Luckily, I lived in a really big apartment building, so I don't think he knew exactly what floor I lived on. But I took a chance and I sent him a message asking him politely to leave me alone. Believe it or not, this went on for 4 years. I would tell him to leave me alone, and he would just come back with more things to say. During those 4 years, I did travel a lot for modeling, so it didn't bother me that much. Not until I got pregnant. He actually sent me a picture of me pregnant. That's when he told me that I had betrayed him and that I was cheating on him. One day I'm at my apartment, and yes, I had already met a man at this time and we were engaged. My fiance was out at work. I decided to take some time off of modeling since I was pregnant. Suddenly I get a knock on my door. I opened the door to a stranger I had never seen before. Obviously at the time I didn't know it was my stalker because I didn't know what he looked like. That's when he hands me a package and he tells me that I must have left it downstairs. I told him I hadn't ordered anything, and then he asked if he could come in. I said no, but he pushed his way in. When he grabbed my hand and started begging for forgiveness. And he confessed that he had been sending me the messages for 4 years. Started yelling at him to leave, but he wouldn't. He tried to kiss my pregnant belly and asked me if it was his son. And that's when I just started kicking and punching him. And I didn't stop until he was out the door. When I looked at his face, he was bleeding and scratched all over. Neighbor had come out and had already called the cops, thank God. Cops arrested him and he was taken away. They were only able to hold him for 2 weeks. Apparently he had not broken any laws. This man is out there free. What should I do? Storytime about how my husband and my dad got into a fist fight on our wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me an Instagram. My dad is in the military, therefore he is super strict. He's never liked any of my boyfriends, and especially my fiance. My fiance is a musician, so he sometimes doesn't have a lot of income, so my dad thinks that he's absolutely lazy. I have a really good job and I always end up making a lot more than my fiance. This means that I have to make up for his lack of money. So usually I end up paying for most of the bills, and my fiance ends up paying for about a third of our rent. And we do live in a nice fancy apartment. I mean, we've got a pool, a sauna, there's a bunch of amenities, and most of the time my fiance only gives me about $500 towards rent. My dad knows all of these issues, and trust me, it is an issue for me because I want him to be able to provide for me and our babies whenever I get pregnant, but it really irks my dad. But of course, it really bothers my dad. Every time my fiance and I go over to my parents for dinner, my dad is always making comments about how he doesn't earn enough money, and he asks him like, how are you going to provide for your family? And that's when my fiance and him usually get into a fight. Our wedding day was quickly approaching, so I wanted to keep a distance between my fiance and my dad. Everything was good up until the reception. My now husband and I were saying hello to friends. Out of nowhere, my dad tackles my husband down. That's when all hell breaks loose. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how my husband and my dad got into a fist fight on our wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I was sending me an Instagram. So my dad body slams my new husband onto the ground. Then of course, all of my husband's friends come attack my dad and try to pull him off of my husband. By the way, my dad is super strong. Like I said in part 1, he's in the army, so he's built and super strong. My dad and my husband were pummeling each other. They were even kicking each other on our wedding day. And yeah, I'm in my wedding dress crying while everyone else is going crazy. Luckily, I invited a friend and her boyfriend is a cop. So he went up to my dad, who was clearly the stronger one in the fight, and was able to restrain him. When they were finally separated, my dad started yelling at my husband, calling him a liar and a cheater. And when I heard my dad say that, my stomach dropped. I knew that my dad had my back and that he probably found out something about my husband. My dad grabs my hand and pulls my mom into a separate room. Then he shows me pictures of my husband with another woman in a parking lot. That's when my dad explained to me that he didn't trust my fiance, so he decided to hire a private investigator to follow him around. Remember in part 1, I said that I was paying for almost everything in our relationship? My dad really hated this, and he was convinced that instead of going to work, my fiance was spending time with another woman. And guess what? He was right. Of course, my dad felt really bad about causing a whole scene, but that's when he told me that we had to annul the marriage. I honestly didn't know what to do at the time, so I told my dad that I needed to speak to my husband. My friend's boyfriend, the cop, was there the whole time. He took my dad out of the room and then brought in my husband. Of course, my mom stayed in the room with me to have some backup, and we grilled my husband for about 20 minutes. First, he denied everything, but when I showed him the picture that my dad showed me, he said it was just a friend. Of course, my mom and I weren't buying it. That's when he finally confessed that it was his old girlfriend and that they were just saying goodbye for one last time. That's when he showed me all the text messages between him and his ex, and everything was pretty innocent. I asked him why he didn't tell me that he was going to go see his ex, and he told me that he just didn't want any drama with my dad. The cop brought my dad back in the room. I asked him to stay inside while my dad and my husband and I talked. I explained to my dad everything that happened, but he wasn't buying his story. My dad kept saying that we just needed to get a divorce. My husband was crying and begging me to forgive him. Then my dad started attacking him again. Once again, the cop had to restrain him and he put him in a chokehold. Part 3 of how my dad attacked my husband on our wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My dad attacked my husband for a second time. Luckily, my friend's boyfriend, who was a cop, was there and was trying to manage the situation. Basically, we called off the entire reception. So $7,000 right down the drain. My husband and I were supposed to leave that night to Greece. I told my parents we should still go on the honeymoon and they agreed. But obviously my dad was really upset about it. But while we were in Greece, I caught my husband texting his ex again. This woman texted him saying that she missed him. Then he told her about the fight he got into with my dad. Then she said that my whole family is crazy and that he shouldn't have married into it. I confronted my husband and he told me that he needed her as a friend and that I just needed to deal with it. Then I told him that I was the one that paid for basically everything in our relationship, including most of our wedding and our honeymoon, and that he needed to be grateful to me and to my family. That's when he said that he would never speak to my family again. That's when I told him that the relationship wasn't going to work then. Now that we're back home, my parents really want me to get a divorce, but I'm not sure. Obviously, he has feelings for his ex and so does she. But I mean, I still love him. Why should I lose out? My husband is being super distant and barely talks to me. My dad is upset with me too because I haven't gotten a divorce. Should I just file for divorce? What should I do?
Story time. Thank you, Tiffany, for sending me the story. So Tiffany and her sister were at the beach facing away from the water, and it was getting dark, the tide was coming in, and they heard these crying noises that kind of sounded like they were coming from the ocean, so they called the police, to make sure everything's okay. So the police show up, they check everywhere, and they don't find anything, so they send out boats to go out even further, just in case somebody's all the way out there. So this started late at night, but this was a party night, so this went all the way till 6 a.m., and everybody had pretty much left. Tiffany and her sister had stayed a little bit longer, and right then comes a woman running out of the alleyway from the nightclub area. She's visibly upset, completely drenched in water as if she had gone swimming, and so Tiffany kind of finds this weird, so she calls the police again. And right as that happens, the girl runs onto the pier and jumps off. Tiffany and her sister are freaking out. The police boats and everything show up and they send them home. A few days later, the police contact Tiffany and ask to meet up so they can ask questions about that night. So the police told Tiffany that the crying came from the woman that was jumping off the pier. She had done this multiple times that night, swimming far out so that the current and the rough waters could drag her under and kill her.
Story time about how I lied to my parents about having a boyfriend for 4 years. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My parents are super strict. Growing up, I could not have any guy friends. I wasn't even allowed to go over to my girlfriends' houses. At school, I was pretty popular, and the fact that my parents didn't let me have any boyfriends made the boys actually want me more, which is something my dad actually hated. Boys would call our house asking to talk to me, and my dad would grill me about it. So I finally decided to tell him that because he doesn't let me date any boys, that boys want me more. He laughed and said that that wasn't true, and that most likely I was just provoking these boys. Obviously, this really upset me. My dad was always really controlling. When I turned 16, I decided I wanted to get my own job. This way I could have some more freedom and just meet more people outside of school. I started working at a local restaurant and quickly made friends with everyone who was working there. They were all pretty much my age, especially one boy. Let's call him Rick. Rick and I hit it off right away. I had a huge crush on him instantly, and I could tell that he liked me too. But of course, my strict parents were always present in my mind, so I tried my best to stay away from Rick just so that I wouldn't develop any feelings, which I already had, who am I kidding? One day, Rick asked me if I wanted to take my break with him, and I said yes. He sat in his car for 30 minutes and just talked the entire time. I started falling in love with him. We talked so much, and he was so kind and so funny. The next few days at work, we were basically inseparable. Finally, at the end of the week, he asked me if I wanted to be his girlfriend, and I said yes. Without a moment of hesitation, I said yes, knowing that my parents would not want that at all. So here's when I told him that we needed to keep this a secret. He wanted to just speak to my parents, but I begged him not to. Thankfully, he understood. The only time we were able to spend together was at work. And we did this for a full year. When I turned 17, my parents insisted that I quit my job so that I could focus on school. I pretty much had to listen to them, so I did. This meant that Rick and I barely ever saw each other. Instead, I decided to sneak him into my house every single night. Part 2 is up. So I started sneaking my boyfriend into my room every single night. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My parents had literally no idea. I snuck my boyfriend Rick into my room every single night for a full year. The only time we ever got close to getting caught, the smoke alarm in our house went off, and as soon as we heard it, Rick jumped out through my window. My room was on the first floor, so this wasn't really an issue at all. I finally graduated from high school and started going to college. It became way easier to hide my relationship from my parents because I was living in a dorm. Rick would come visit me every single weekend, and my parents would come to visit me every now and then. Even when I was in college, you guys, my parents were still super strict. So one One day I decided to ask my dad when I could have a boyfriend. He said when I was living under my own roof and paying my own bills. So the following year, that's exactly what I did. I was able to get a good job in my field, and so did Rick. So we put our money together and his parents helped us to get an apartment. But here's the thing, I didn't want my parents to know that I had a boyfriend this whole time. So instead I told them that Rick was my roommate who I met in college, and that I finally just decided that I wanted my own freedom. My dad was really proud of me for taking the initiative, which was crazy to me. He said he was proud of me. My mom, on the other hand, definitely did not want me moving in with some guy. So I invited Rick over to my parents' house, they met him for a little bit, and they actually liked him. Fast forward 6 years, Rick and I are married, and my parents don't know that he was my boyfriend for 4 years. They think that we started dating after we moved in together. I kind of want to tell my parents, but I'm not sure. I think they would get really upset and possibly not speak to me. What do you think I should do? Story time about how I caught my mom hooking up with my guy best friend. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I'm sending me on Instagram. My best friend and I have known each other for 7 years. Let's call him Mark. Mark and I met when we were in school, and we have been inseparable since then. Everyone's constantly telling us that we should date, but we're not into each other like that. Last year, my parents started fighting a lot because my dad found out that my mom cheated on him. And she cheated on him with my dad's best friend. My mom's the kind of woman that constantly seeks attention from men. And growing up, she weirdly competed with me. Like anytime I liked a boy, she would flirt with him in front of me. So yeah, my mom's not the best when it comes to stuff like that. So when my dad found out that my mom was cheating on him, I basically just wanted to keep the peace, and I convinced my dad to not get a divorce. Huge mistake. Fast forward to 2 months ago. Mark was just about to turn 20, so I had been planning a birthday party for him. Because of COVID, I was only inviting our immediate family and close friends. And of course, my mom had to interject and wanted to help me plan everything. I told her several times I didn't need her help, but she insisted. Let me just say this, before any of this happened, it never occurred to me that my mom was even attracted to Mark. I saw him as like a brother to me, so I assumed that she would see him the same way. My mom and dad kept arguing every single day. Mark would come over and he would just let me vent to him. The day of Mark's birthday party is when I started noticing some weird things. My mom, of course, had to drink a lot of champagne, so she was getting a little tipsy. She insisted on dancing with Mark and like making this big scene, so they started dancing. More people joined the dance floor and it became like a real party. A few hours later, I see my mom and Mark sitting on the couch, but my mom is crying her eyeballs out, complaining about my dad, and Mark is just there listening to her. I mean, she's putting him in a weird position. I literally had to peel my mom off of Mark and take her home and put her into bed. Thankfully, Mark just thought it was funny, so he didn't get upset. A few weeks later, I come home and find Mark in the kitchen with my mom. Once again, my mom is drinking and complaining about my dad. And once again, Mark is just listening to her. But here's the thing. My mom was standing there in a bikini, supposedly ready to get in the pool. Part 2 is... So my mom is standing there in a bikini trying to seduce my guy best friend. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I'm sending me on Instagram. I asked my mom nicely to go put on some clothes and she refused. So I grabbed Mark's hand and told him to come upstairs with me. I asked him what was going on between him and my mom and he said nothing. And he even said that I was ridiculous for even suggesting something like that. And I believed him, so I let it go. A few days later, my mom is dressed up all sexy in a red tight dress, supposedly making breakfast for my dad and I. But my dad had already left for work, and I was going to school, so she knew that. I had the feeling that she had Mark coming over and she didn't want me to know. So I got in my car and told her I was leaving for school. Instead, I waited around the corner and I saw Mark driving up to the house. I waited for about 10 minutes and then I quietly pulled into the driveway and opened the door. And what do you know? My mom is sitting on the countertop making out with my guy best friend. And they were going at it. Like if I hadn't gotten there, it would have happened, you know? I slammed the door and my mom jumps off the counter. Mark pretends that nothing's wrong and tells me that he has to go to school. But of course, I didn't let him leave. That's when my mom told me that they were in love. And what do you know? Mark confirmed it. That's when my mom basically begged me not to tell my dad anything and that her and Mark were going to continue seeing each other. I told my mom I'd keep the secret, but instead, I drove straight to my dad's job and told him everything. He went straight to his lawyer and filed for divorce. When he confronted her, my mom basically said that I was lying and that I had for some reason made everything up. Mark, on the other hand, is totally in love with her, but she's telling him to leave her alone. So she also broke his heart. He doesn't even want to go back to school and he's begging me to get my mom and him back together. I told him that that would never happen because my mom is never going to leave my dad. My dad makes a lot of money and she has no job. He provides her a lifestyle that Mark could never. Now here's the thing, my mom's accusing me of being a terrible daughter for telling my dad, but how could I not tell my dad? I mean, am I the asshole here? I doubt it, but what do you guys think? What should I do? Story time about how my neighbor tried to unalive me. 4 years ago, my husband and I had just moved into a new neighborhood. We were newly married and were trying to have kids right away. My husband and I were also really social, so we would invite our neighbors over and host parties. We had a really big, beautiful house with a pool, so we always took advantage. Mostly everyone on our block would come to our get-togethers, but there was always this one couple that never showed up. I didn't think anything of it until one of my neighbors told me not to invite them to any other event in the future. When I asked her why, she said the police would go off into their house, and that the husband and the family was suspected of abusing the entire family. Obviously, after this, I stopped inviting them. Every single day I would go on walks with my husband. Well, one night my husband decided to stay home, so I went by myself. I decided to change my route and walk in front of the neighbor's house, the one everyone was scared of, and as soon as I turned down the street, I saw a man by the window. I looked away really fast because I didn't want him to think that I was staring, although I was. Suddenly, his front door opens and he comes outside. And all he says is, "You're the new neighbor, right?" I simply replied, "Yes, and nice to meet you." He stared at me for a few seconds, didn't say anything, and closed his door. I obviously thought this was strange. I kept walking, but a few minutes later, I noticed that he was right behind me, and something told me to run back home, which I did. That's when I realized he knew where I lived. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how my neighbor tried to unalive me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I ran back home as quickly as I could. I told my husband that the neighbor followed me home, but he told me to just forget about it. A few days later, I come home from running some errands. I get out of my car, and out of the corner of my eye, I see my neighbor standing behind a tree, and I could tell that he's looking at me. I decided to just ignore it because I didn't actually want to have to make conversation. Instead, I grabbed the groceries and walked into the house. I began closing the door, but he pushed his way in. I backed away and asked him what he wanted. He asked me if my husband was home. And no, my husband was not home, but I said yes. Then he looks around and asks me if he could get a little tour of the house. He also said that he really wanted to see the pool. Okay, I know what you're gonna think, but I was so scared I thought that if I just showed him the house, he would leave. I walk him over to the backyard and he starts looking around. That's when he asked me if we had any security cameras. My hands and knees started to shake, and once again I lied and said yes. He started looking around some more and said, "Nope, you definitely don't have any." I told him I needed to leave the house and if he could just leave. He starts to laugh and tells me that I should be nicer to him. He ripped my phone out of my hands and threw it into the pool. Instantly, I sprinted away from him. He grabbed my hair and I fell really hard to the ground. Part 3 is up.
I never really saw you coming until you turned me around. I used to think I was nothing, but look at this love we found. So give me your hand like you took mine. No, I don't ever wanna see you cry. Oh, yeah, no more tears. Oh, yeah, no more tears. Take that chance, we'll be fine. No, I don't ever wanna see you cry. Oh, yeah, no more tears. Oh, yeah, no more tears.
Part 3 of how my neighbor tried to unalive me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. He pulled my hair hard and I fell to the ground. That's when I just started kicking as hard as I could. I heard him scream and he fell back. I got up and ran straight back into the house and locked the door behind me. He came up to the door and started banging on it. He told me if I didn't let him in that he would break the door. That's when he grabbed a chair and started throwing it against the glass. Luckily, the windows are hurricane proof, so he couldn't come in. I called 911 and then my husband. I went around the house locking every single door and window. He would just follow me from window to window yelling at me. He told me he just wanted to talk to me and that I was overreacting. Finally, I could hear the sirens around the corner. And of course, he started running away. Finally, the cops found him. His pockets, they found zip ties, and his car was loaded with rope and different things. Apparently, he planned on taking me to the woods. He's now in prison, but I'm so scared that he'll get out. What should I do? Story time about how I hooked up with my stepbrother. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I repeat, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. My dad and I moved to a new town after he got divorced from my mom. The plan would be that I would split my time with my mom and my dad. Now, with the divorce, I actually got really depressed and it really did affect me. Also, I had just turned 18 at the time and I didn't really want to go to college, so I didn't know what to do with my life. My mom asked me if I wanted to go on a trip to Europe with her and I said yes. So my mom and I traveled for about 2 months. When I got home, I decided to go spend time with my dad for a few months. Well, guess what? He already had a new girlfriend. And of course, this affected me really, really badly. And my mom too. Her and I were both surprised that he moved on so quickly. His new girlfriend was okay. She was much younger than my mom, but still older than me. But here's the thing, she had 4 kids. She invited me and my dad to come over for dinner so that we could get to know her kids a bit better. Mind you, I had never met them at this point. I had just gotten back from Europe. So I go over to their house for dinner, and as soon as I walk in, I am greeted by the 2 most beautiful guys I have ever seen in my entire life. They were both in their early 20s, and like I said, I was 18. The other 2 kids were teenagers. Throughout the dinner, I couldn't stop staring at both of these guys. I was really trying not to be obvious, but I had just never seen such beautiful guys. It turns out one of them was actually a model, and the other one was a bodybuilder. So you can imagine what they might have looked like. Also, throughout the dinner, they kept making eye contact with me. It was almost like they were competing. After dinner, my dad and I went back to his place. This is when my dad asked me what I really thought of his girlfriend. And I told him that I didn't think he should have moved on that quickly, but at the same time, she was actually a good person. She obviously cared about her kids, and they had a pretty good life. That's when my dad told me that he was going to ask her to marry him. They had not been together very long, but I said, okay. Of course, my dad asked me to plan the whole thing with him. He proposed, and of course, she said yes. And this is when it hit me. These 2 really attractive guys were now going to be my stepbrothers. Awkward. This also meant that I started hanging out more and more at their house. My dad and I would go over for dinners, we would all spend the day in the pool, and basically just hang out. And this meant that I started getting to know my stepbrothers a little better. Right away, I could tell that they were starting to flirt with me while we were all together and separately. Of course, I was totally single, so I was like, well, you know, whatever. After dinner one night, my dad asked me if I was interested in one of them. And I was like, no, Dad. He told me that I couldn't stop staring at the guys and that I needed to calm down. Oh my God. I was totally blushing and I told him that nothing was gonna happen and not to worry. I decided to put some space between me and the guys. One of them actually decided to reach out on Instagram and ask me why I was being so cold. Obviously, I didn't tell him that my dad told me to stay away from them, so I just pretended like I didn't know what he was talking about. That's when he asked me if I wanted to join him and his friends to go to the movies. I couldn't resist and I said yes. While we were watching the movie, he actually grabbed onto my hand and kissed it. And he kissed me, part 2. Stepbrother grabbed my hand and kissed me in the movie theater. I was totally shocked. I knew that he had been flirting with me, but I didn't think that he was going to take it that far as to kiss me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. I repeat, this is not my story time. By the way, we were with 2 of his other friends. So these guys knew that I was his stepsister. After the movie, we all went back to his car and they drove me home. We didn't speak for the rest of the night. Obviously, I was already falling in love with him. I mean, he was so cute, so nice, and he liked me. The following day, my dad and I went over to his girlfriend's house, aka the mother of my stepbrother. That's when my stepbrother came up to me and grabbed my hand. I pulled it away as soon as I could because I thought someone had seen us. Luckily, the coast was clear. He took me to his bedroom and we just made out, while the rest of the family is downstairs having food. After about 10 minutes, we decided to go back downstairs. My stepbrother sat next to me and underneath the table, he kept grabbing my knee. I was terrified that someone would see this. I mean, it's almost like he didn't care if we got caught. After that, my dad and I went home. And about 30 minutes after we got home, my stepbrother calls me and tells me that he's out front. I told him there was no way I could let him in and that he should just go home. And before I knew it, he had snuck in through my window. This is when I realized that I needed him to calm down because if we got caught, my dad would get really upset. I told him that he shouldn't have done that and that he needed to go home. That's when he confessed that he was in love with me. I mean, we had known each other for a few months, but we had only kissed like twice. He told me from the moment he set his eyes on me, he couldn't stop thinking about me. And he told me that him and his stepbrother actually fought over who would get to date me. I was actually flattered, but also concerned. That's when he told me that we should just date and we shouldn't care what our parents think. At first I said no, but then he kept trying to convince me. Suddenly, my dad knocks on my door and asks me who I'm talking to. Part 3 is up. As my stepbrother is confessing to me that he's in love with me, my dad knocks on the door. My stomach sank really quick. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent to me on Instagram. I repeat, this is not my story time. My dad knocks on the door and asks me who I'm talking to. That's when my stepbrother runs into my closet and just hides. I opened the door and explained to my dad that I was on the phone with a friend. He said okay and just left. But I could tell that he was suspicious. I let my stepbrother out of the closet and told him to leave. That's when he said that he wanted to stay over. Oh my God, I could have just died at that moment. That's when my dad opens the door and catches him. That's when my dad chased him around the house and told him to leave. I was beyond mortified. Oh, and I forgot to mention, my dad and my stepmom were already married. So he calls her and tells her everything that happened. Of course, I denied that he and I did anything, but my dad was not believing me. He told me that while I still lived under his roof, I had to follow his rules. And that meant not dating my stepbrother. The very next day, my stepbrother calls me and asks me to move in with him. He told me that we should get our own apartment and that way we can be happy together. Honestly, I didn't even know what to say because I wasn't in love with him like he said he was in love with me. Of course, this made my dad even more angry. He warned my stepbrother to stay away from me. Obviously, this is causing problems between him and his new wife. And yeah, I feel really bad. Now that I haven't seen my stepbrother in about a week, I'm starting to realize that maybe I am in love with him. Because I can't stop thinking about him and all I want to do is spend time with him and call him. So I'm seriously considering moving in with him, but I'm not sure how this is going to affect my dad or his new marriage. I mean, it's not like we're blood related and I'm already 18. So my dad kind of has to accept this, but he's so stubborn. Now my stepbrother wants me to be his girlfriend and I don't know what to say. I really need some advice. Help.
My boyfriend, 21 male, and I, 20 female, have been together for almost 3 years. Last night, we were looking at furniture on his phone for our new apartment. We are moving in together in 2 months. I have a habit of swiping out of all apps and tabs when I'm done with them, and in doing so, I saw something I really wish I hadn't. It was a tab that said, quote, 40-year-old MILF, mom, big tits, short black hair. He described my mom. When I turned the phone to show him, he just sat there looking shocked for a minute. Then he started stuttering, crying, and apologizing. All I said was, quote, are you attracted to my mom? Do you watch that looks like my mom? He kept apologizing over and over, and I just asked him to explain. It took him a while to get the words out. He admitted he is attracted to older women, moms specifically. He said he was just curious, and it came to his mind to search my mom's description to, quote, see if there were any stars that looked like her. He claims it was a one-time thing and showed me the rest of his history, which was mostly just stepsister, lesbian, and sometimes MILF, but no other searches that matched my mom's description. He was so embarrassed by it. I don't really care that he watches. I'm not trying to judge him or shame him, but I just feel so grossed out and humiliated that my boyfriend thought about my mom. He also said he promises he doesn't have a weird obsession with my mom and doesn't think about her like that when we are with her. He also said it's normal for guys with mommy issues to be into MILFs. He has extensive mommy issues. And not that that's an excuse, but I can see how his mom-related trauma could shape the kinds of porn he watches. I can't help but feel disgusted that my partner is attracted to my mom. We talked about this for a long time last night, and he apologized. Said he was going to talk to a therapist, and overall seemed really remorseful and conscious of my feelings. He promised it would never happen again, but I'm just afraid that he will still feel some type of way about her. When I told him that I'm scared that this is something deeper, he denied it. Then he said he thinks that it's normal for guys to be attracted to their girlfriends' moms, especially since my mom is still pretty young. Him trying to normalize it made it feel even more disgusting to me. Is that true? This whole thing is making me second guess if we should move in together, but I don't want this relationship to be over. He is a good person and a great boyfriend, and I just can't believe this is happening. I love him so much, and aside from this, we don't have any other major issues.